Howdy everyone, this is just me showing up before the video saying that this was meant to be the second video in a series where I defended media that people heavily disliked for partly reasonable but fiercely unnuanced reasons. But I deleted the first video as it was defending Mask by Dream in light of recent allegations against him. I've done my best to rework the script and editing between recordings, but it involves different audio recordings while I reworded a couple of things slightly, so sorry if my voice sounds a bit funky in some places. Anyway, enjoy the show.
This is it, boys. This is war. What are we waiting for? Why don't we break the rules already?
Fanfiction is something that gets a bit of a bad rap in media. It's commonly used as a punchline, a pejorative for when people defer wholeheartedly to things considered to be wish fulfillment fantasies, usually in reference to the supernatural, religious, or just incredibly out there conspiracy theories, with little to no basis in scientific reality. Describing someone's beliefs as fanfiction is typically regarded as a slam dunk, pointing out how absolutely poorly substantiated they are and basically mocking the idea of taking them seriously. And while this is funny and all, and those people do need to be disregarded in some way, it's probably a good idea to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves and make sure that we aren't just making a ham-fisted comparison because it feels like the lowest common denominator. Because fanfiction deserves more than that. So, what is fanfiction exactly? Well, here's the most basic gist I can give you, because A, there's more to fanfiction than can possibly be put into words, believe me, and B, I've been fighting with my co-writer non-stop for months to try and shorten this section as much as possible. If you want a more in-depth explanation than this one, check out this video here, but anyway. Some people enjoy media fairly casually. They'll watch the latest MCU movie, go, well that made increasingly little sense, but I enjoyed the explosions. They leave the cinema, forget about it, and then come back 3 months later for the next one. Some more creatively inclined people, however, will watch the same MCU movie and come out going, do you think Captain America and Iron Man ever explored each other's bodies? Unable to stop thinking about that until they find fandom spaces to discuss it in. Fandom communities often expand upon the original text by creating or expanding upon characters, plot holes, general details, backstory, and lore, which are often missing or lacking in the original canon. These fan creations are known and referred to as headcanons, and if a headcanon becomes widely accepted within a specific fandom, it becomes fan canon, shortened to fanon. An example of headcanon would be Harry Potter becoming a teacher after the final book instead of an aura, aka a wizard cop, because while a heavily abused, trauma-ridden child with a penchant for violence and undoubtedly a persecution complex would be a perfect fit for a police force in a racist, puritanical society led by turf mother J.K. Rowling, many people believe it would be a much better, much more reasonable ending for the character and the surrounding canon if he chose to actually serve the community in the same way that the two professors he named his children after. An example of fanon would be the Avengers actually liking each other within the MCU. On the surface, there are some things you can criticize fanfiction for as a medium. It's what's known as a digital pulp format, and is by design inherently derivative. It uses a lot of already established characters which are heavily copyrighted, so making money just by writing fanfiction is difficult to do legally. And even though there are protections in many places for non-commercial work, and the vast majority of writers don't monetize their fanfiction, some authors still take issue with it. Cough cough J.K. Rowling, cough cough. And that's a debate I do not want to muddy my hands with. I'll leave that to my legal team, who are also known as the gremlins underneath my bed. Fanfiction hosting sites also tend to have less quality control than publishing companies do. Now, it's important to note that this doesn't mean it's worse necessarily. There are many bad printed books full of spelling and grammatical mistakes, and there are many fanfiction writers who have made incredible pieces of art meticulously crafted over the course of many years. But what it does mean is that the bad stuff is a lot easier to stumble upon. Fanfiction, like many other storytelling mediums, has plenty of tropes, cliches, and writing quirks that act as limitations that can hold back less talented writers' work, which again, thanks to lower quality control, is easier to stumble upon. Fanfiction tends to be written with the understanding that the average reader has an intricate knowledge of the characters within the source material, so that rather than rewriting the original text but in their own style, they can instead focus in on what's happening to their poor little meow meow Draco Malfoy. Because to the people who read and write Harry Potter fanfiction, the audience already knows who Draco goddamn Malfoy is. So if your friend recommends a fanfiction about a book series you maybe haven't read in many years, this could make the text less palatable or fulfilling to you, since you don't have the understanding of the text that's expected of you. Alternatively, characters from established universes being cut and pasted into a totally new setting can be jarring and totally immersion-breaking to more grounded, unimaginative minds. And even though this is the main draw to fanfiction in the first place for many people, it's just as possible for it to turn you away from the art form, and that's totally fine. You don't have to engage with something that you don't enjoy. But also, you can just ignore it, just scroll away, turn off your computer, go outside, and touch some pavement. The fanfiction can't hurt you there. Sometimes you'll see videos like this one, or this one, or this one, since a lot of fanfiction writers use song lyrics for the name of their fanfics, because titles are hard to come up with. And if you're putting time and effort into a long-term creative writing endeavor, you don't want to then have to put more time and effort into a catchy title that has to draw in an audience and impress people who read it. So naturally, you'll take the lowest common denominator, use some line from a song by the Mountain Goats because it reminds you of Draco Goddamn Malfoy, and you don't need to worry about it. Some fanfiction gets written about real, actual people, not just characters from a piece of media. Personally, I think fanfiction written about real-life people, especially minor celebrities and celebrity minors, frequently crosses the line from speculative fictional narratives into stalkerish parasocial obsession.
That's a human person.
Especially when things tilt towards the 18+ rating. That being said, it's reductive to say that all fanfiction about real-life people is inherently parasocial, stalkery, or negative. People can form connections to celebrities in the same way they form connections to fictional characters. But fanfiction can certainly exacerbate that mentality within fandom spaces. Also, let's not kid ourselves, some fanfiction is just bad. To many people, their exposure to fanfiction begins and ends at 50 Shades of Grey, and there's very little that's good about 50 Shades of Grey. And if that's the only fanfiction you know of, that's gonna give you a skewed perception of fanfiction as a medium. Bad art, and bad writing in particular, is very fun to make fun of. Video reenactments of poorly written fanfiction are objectively hilarious, and I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that they're not. That being said, however, there are some really boring, gross, and repetitive arguments that get brought up way too often, which are bad, they're repetitive, they don't hold any weight, they're repetitive, unoriginal, and are repetitive. Did I say they're repetitive? Because I think I'm repeating myself a bit. For example, the argument that fanfiction is made by and for teenage girls and is therefore garbage, or that it's not canonical but is instead experimentation with different characters from different universes and is therefore impure media, or that it allows teenage girls to enjoy aforementioned impure media and is therefore garbage. The unfortunate truth is that because fanfiction doesn't cater specifically to men, it's seen as an inherently worthless medium, despite covering more than twice as much narrative ground as male action films such as James Bond, Transformers, Resident Evil do. And while each of these films' merit is hotly debated in online spaces, no one even questions if they're worth discussing to begin with. No one asks if you should bring them to the table when you're discussing real pieces of media. And it's by the virtue of being male-centric, being made by and for men, and specifically to represent men, they're assumed to be valuable and worthy enough to exist without question, whether that is as iconic franchises or even just as bad movies. That same charitability often isn't granted to fanfiction or media targeted at women. You might hear that fanfiction is just porn for girls, setup and punchline, and even if that were remotely true, and believe me, it's not, these arguments are intensely puritanical, and God forbid teenage girls explore their sexuality authentically with elaborate works of fiction at the same age that teenage boys do. Fanfiction is just a medium of storytelling, and it contains narratives that encompass the whole human experience. Every genre, every type of story you can think of has been attempted by a 13-year-old with a dodgy internet connection and a dream. To dismiss the entire medium as just pornography would be akin to dismissing all movies as trashy, self-flagellating garbage, not fit to see the light of day because The Room was an absolute train wreck. Arguments like these, which are so aggressively and unequivocally bad that they barely even dignify a response, are almost universally made from a place of sexism and or ignorance, and even on the rare occasions where the person making them is not sexist, the arguments still are, and if you sincerely believe any of them to be true, then that is As the kids say, a you problem. But an important thing to note is that fanfiction, specifically fanfiction websites, have in some respects democratized the writing process. To be an established writer, no longer do you need to be able to set aside a year and a half of your life and have the financial stability to give you double digits of hours of free time each week, and the capability and mental fortitude to conjure up and build upon an entirely new fictional universe all in your brain, and enough money, fame, and wealthy connections to buy access to a publisher that'll mass produce your books for you. All you need now is internet access, a Wattpad account that hasn't been hacked, and an already existing work of fiction to geek out over, and you can publish your fiction online, one chapter at a time. You can get a short introductory chapter written in about 2 hours if you're a fast writer, and if your writing is engaging and people like it enough, then you can get a fairly decent amount of internet traction, and an audience following you well enough to support your passion. And sure, people with more free time will still be more likely to get recognized, purely because they're able to write more often and have more time to spell check, edit, and redraft their work before publishing. But it does mean that the best writers will tend to get more attention than they would in the original publishing world. Or at least that would be the case if it wasn't for My Immortal. Now, what is My Immortal? I hear you yell in my general direction as if you didn't click on this video knowing exactly what it is. And I am so glad you asked. My Immortal is a Harry Potter fanfiction written from the end of February to the end of April of 2006 by two young teenage girls called Tara and Raven. The true identities of these two people are currently unknown, and it's likely to stay that way forever, although many communities online are hard-pressed on finding out. Originally, I was going to delve much deeper into this after finding myself deep inside a rabbit hole for days and days on end, but then I came to my senses and decided to stop. If they wanted to be known publicly, they would come forward admitting their authorship, and at this point it seems like they want to keep their identity private. People's online identities don't stop being private just because they do something you're personally invested in.
That's a human person.
Anyway, this fanfiction follows a protagonist called Ebony, Dementia, Way, a name so beautiful that it defies any explanation other than yes, that apostrophe is there on purpose. She is a vampire, a witch, and a goth, and attends Hogwarts school. As a self-insert OC, she is clearly inspired by both the goth emo counterculture of the time and an expansion upon the mythology within the Harry Potter universe, most of which you could probably have gathered from the title of the fanfiction and the protagonist being called Ebony, Dementia, Way. And if you didn't get all of that, it's outright stated in the first paragraph. My Immortal is widely considered to be, let's not mince words, the worst fanfiction ever written. One of the defining features of this fanfiction is the copious amount of author's notes in each edit and chapter update. Many of them break the fourth wall to have arguments with the audience, who are no doubt eviscerating the fanfiction in front of them. However, the USP of this fanfiction is that each and every one of these author's notes is written in the dialect of the late 2000s alt internet scene, kind of like this when you remove sub-letters and spell them weirdly, which unfortunately has gone heavily out of fashion and aged incredibly poorly. And while the rest of the text at least tries to present in a slightly more upstanding way, the author's notes stand out and provide a jarring contrast to the meat of the fanfiction. And they seem to have catapulted this fanfic from niche trash to parasocial garbage, an insight into the mind of an author of something this intense. The meat of the fanfiction, by the way, is very dialogue heavy and very exposition light. It chooses not to waste time or words describing relevant places or people, choosing instead to name the place and allow the reader to insert their own interpretations of the setting. That being said, there are certain things that are not left to interpretation and described in heavy detail, that being where the story delineates from traditional Hogwarts experiences. Most of this is just the outfits of the main characters, Ebony and her friend Willow, both fictional representations of Tara and Raven respectively, as noted by the author's note right after Willow was introduced saying, "Raven, this is you." It's similar to how in cartoons where an object is more detailed than the rest of the background and you can tell that it's going to be picked up or interacted with soon. This sporadic focus is also a pretty common trope in self-insert fanfiction, and is generally a hurdle that usually slightly poorer writers tend to fall over. So it should come as no shock that Tara and Raven not only fell over at this hurdle, but after setting it up again, chose essentially to duck under it and stick to their guns through all 44 chapters. If you think it ends there, it does not. The text is also littered with grammatical and spelling mistakes. Ebony's name is misspelled plenty of times as both Ennaby and Ebony. Remus Lupin, or Lupin spelled with 2 O's as opposed to a U, is shown masticating to Ebony at one point. Voldemort speaks in ye olde English for some reason. Ellipses are used very liberally to the point of pointlessness, and the word thanks is replaced with fangs whenever it's Ebony saying it, lest we forget that she is a vampire. Arguably not a mistake, definitely a questionable writing decision. The author also uses passionately and passively entirely interchangeably, and be careful of chapter 14 because some of that chapter is extremely scray and viewer excretion is advised. As you delve a little deeper into the story, there's no way about it, just poorly written smut. It's bad, it's really bad. The main character finds herself in a love triangle between Harry Potter, whose first name is changed in the fiction to Vampire, and Draco Malfoy, except the centre of the triangle is not our main character, but instead Draco, which isn't a problem on its own, but if you're going to write convincing romance, you need the characters involved to have at least some semblance of chemistry, and even using the word chemistry in the same sentence as My Immortal would be giving the authors credit where credit is not due. The writing of more intimate scenes in the text is both to the point and disturbingly juvenile, the prime example being Draco putting his thingy into my you-know-what, and that being about the end of the encounter. All that isn't to mention some of the problematic text within the fanfiction, and I say text because believe me, nothing is left to subtext. This is a 44-part story written 1 paragraph and 1 dialogue scene at a time in places, and everything that the authors wanted to say was said exactly when and how they wanted to say it. There is explicit endorsement of self-harm, self-harming tendencies, and threats of self-harm. There are many author's notes written by Tara which simultaneously fetishize gay men and sensitive bi men, and then imply outward disgust at the idea of being lesbian. And also, because it was 2006 and they were 14, ableist and homophobic slurs are, naturally, used very frivolously. And that's not to mention that this fanfiction, at its absolute core, is a barely if at all teenage girl writing multiple older teen characters in lewd sexual scenarios with her own self-insert character. There's many questions to be asked about the existence of explicit material written by an author so young, especially when it comes to the internet and its devastating carelessness with regards to accessibility. But that's a completely different topic for another day. Ultimately, the text takes many leaps in logic, in that the progression is less of a well-constructed or even constructed narrative, more a chain of events that just so happen to happen in the order that they do, with very little logical cohesion. A lot of the locations tend to just be the stage in which action happens, and hold very little meaning to the narrative, which maybe explains the lack of description that comes with their introduction. To interpret the text correctly, the places and the characters in the story also need to be interpreted as your personal experience with them, or to put it more accurately, Tara's personal experience. This not only includes characters like Draco Malfoy and Harry Vampire Potter, or places within Hogwarts, Hogsmeade and the Great Hall, but also members of bands that show up, or rather don't show up, spoiler alert by the way, they end up being Death Eaters. At best, this is the wacky self-insert fantasy of a teenage girl with clumsy writing at the crossroads between the Harry Potter, emo, and goth scenes of 2006. And at worst, it's a literary disaster piece so elaborate that takes itself so seriously in such a way that it could never possibly be anything other than a genuine attempt at producing something enjoyable. It's a piece of literature that your brain literally cannot make sense of until the 5th or 6th time reading because it's written so off-kilter that your sheer sense of disbelief at the horrendous writing overshadows any immersion until you've completely desensitized yourself to it. By all means, it's the literary equivalent of someone who, not for lack of trying, just cannot play the violin and yet insists upon doing so anyway. And then instead of showing just their family and friends, they filmed it on a 2006 flip phone and uploaded the raw, uncut footage to the internet for the world to see. And I fucking love it.
This one is not for the folks at home. Sorry to leave, mama had to go. What's the dialogue?
Aside from just being badly written and bad in content, This piece of fiction is problematic on its own merits, of which, let's be clear, there are very few of. However, that isn't to say that problematic media cannot be enjoyed purely within the confines of fiction and within fictional standards. Enjoying stories written to portray problematic events and or emotional elements, for example, isn't inherently bad. Fiction is an avenue for exploring things that are, in many ways, undesirable, illegal, and or dangerous to go out and experience in real life. Most of that is due to the ultimate principle of fiction.
It never happened. It's false. It's fiction. We made up this one. This one was invented by a writer. It never happened.
You have total control of what you're creating or experience. You can always turn off the TV or put down the book or close the tab, and whatever was too much for you will immediately stop happening. You have the ultimate safe word, and that's the X in the top right corner, or top left if you're an Apple user. That doesn't mean it can't still be hurtful or harmful to consume, as fiction can absolutely be risky in terms of reopening or even causing trauma, especially if it isn't adequately labelled with triggers and content warnings. But even so, it gives you so much more control than you could ever reasonably have in real life. It allows us, if we choose, to become immersed in events which would undoubtedly be absolutely horrible to go through, but in a much safer, much more ethical way, whether it's for the purposes of narrative fulfillment or just personal curiosity. For example, and this may be a controversial statement here, but I will go on the record in saying that I'm personally not a fan of when the people I love the most in the world die in a car explosion. However, when Jack Starbright was exploded in Scorpio Rising, the 9th book in the Alex Rider series, I was very much emotionally moved in a way that made the work of fiction a lot heavier for me to digest, and it added to the narrative in a very meaningful way. Alternatively, some pieces of fiction present problematic or taboo behaviours and activities as otherwise normal or good, as a way to present internal conflict right away between our affinity for the protagonist and our own personal morals and reservations. Some pieces of media lead up towards presenting these taboos, which may include, but are not limited to, abusive dynamics, dire stressful situations, or just graphic porn, as justifiable or reasonable throughout the course of a story, as a way to perhaps push us from the familiar towards the unfamiliar, and slowly amass that same tension and conflict to a building point in order to then resolve, or not resolve, the story. This doesn't necessarily mean that the author thinks that these things are good, actually, or that we should come to that conclusion ourselves, but it is a tool in the fiction writer's arsenal which can be used to create tension within the narrative, rather than an endorsement of these concepts in reality. Also, sometimes you can just enjoy things that are kind of problematic. The tension between the good aspects of something and the bad aspects of it can just live together in your mind, and that's fine. As a personal example, I make an effort to steer clear of terms like psychopath and sociopath, because casually throwing around insults directed at people who have a limited emotional capacity isn't a good idea in my opinion, and yet I still jam to the song Sociopath by Stay Loose because holy shit, that beat fucks heavy ass. All that being said, I don't think my Immortal is that deep. It has its problematic elements and explicit homophobia, but that's because, again, the writers of this thing were like 14 at most. They're just kids having fun and being edgy on the internet, and probably grew up with mildly homophobic and vaguely fetishistic attitudes. It's 2006. Let them grow up in peace, and let them enjoy the internet.
The most amazing things they can come from.
The story of how this fanfiction has been immortalized within internet folklore is not mine to tell. I'm not going to dig up internet archives just to dox two people who probably don't want to come forward and admit to writing a universally hated fanfiction as teenagers. And although the fanfiction is objectively bad for very many reasons, I also want to defend it somewhat. Mostly to try and offset at least a little bit of the frankly unwarranted negative press that's been constructed around it and its mythos. Because honestly, it's just a bad fanfiction. You don't really have to read into it any further than that. It's hard to describe why and how I love this fanfiction so much, because there's so many layers to it. Part of it is because I like ribbing it and poking fun at it. The name Ebony, Darkness, Dementia, Raven Way will never not be funny to me, and there will never be enough videos making fun of and criticizing this piece of high art. And let's not deny it, media is fun to criticize. Looking at something that you know intuitively is bad and trying to answer why you feel that way is an interesting exercise. Part of it is just hyperfixation. Learning more about something that other people are interested in is addictive, and something with such internet-wide infamy is a rabbit hole waiting to be explored and analysed and overanalyzed until you end up doxing 2 kids on accident and no one wants to talk to you because you keep bringing up the entire backstory of a bad piece of media. Not that that's happened to me, of course. Part of it is also nostalgia. My Immortal has been so mythologized in our collective internet communities that all the information about it has been refined and sensationalized to be much more efficient and memorable. And its infamy is far beyond the internet, far beyond fandom communities at least, and it's become something to reminisce about with other people who were in Harry Potter fandoms or emo fandoms or goth fandoms or fandom space in general. And I was a member of emo and Harry Potter communities in days of old, and for a long time My Immortal was all anyone would talk about in those groups. So I picked up information automatically. The memories I have today about the fanfiction have been filtered through almost 2 decades of community interference and interaction and internet folklore. And the community has somehow manufactured for ourselves a time to look back on a little bit more fondly. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Not only because thinking back to a simpler time is escapism from the real world, which is doing so great right now, but also because I was in fandoms. I wrote self-insert fanfiction where I was unrealistically cool and epic, and no, you can't read it. I know how an obsession with certain established universes can inspire you to create, even if you've never written anything before. I know how it feels to have a passion project, where your faith in your creation is as emphatic as it is woefully unfounded. And if I was exposed to the internet to the same extent as these teenagers were, I would have posted it online in very much the same way. My Immortal reminds me of how I was back then, and how much I kind of miss those times, and miss believing in those fun little fantasies that lead to writing a piece of fiction that resonates with you. But also, it's kind of an act of defiance. For some reason, people love giving things a hard time that are either marketed at or have a majority audience of teenage girls and young women, because berating young women for just existing is funny apparently. And like it or not, My Immortal is a passion project. It was created by a real human being who poured her heart and soul into this for many months, primarily for her own enjoyment, only for it to then get labelled by everyone across the entire internet as the petulant, gross imaginations of a teenage girl who did something so audacious as being bad at writing. And even though it is badly written, standing by it and defending it, even just for the purpose of shielding it in the wake of misogyny, which undoubtedly played into the backlash, is, in my opinion, a morally upstanding thing to do. Being in the public eye at all at such a young age is arguably child abuse, especially if it's being used to ridicule you and your labour of love. Teenage girls who write fanfiction online don't have artistic vision, they have a death wish, so I just want to kind of offset the negative attention that comes as a result of aggressively misogynistic attacks that have come its way over the years, which basically means that yes, I am a hero and a feminist icon. To me, My Immortal perfectly portrays the combination of art and democracy. Democracy because anyone with internet access and access to the English-speaking world, regardless of their age, gender, orientation, race, creed, can publish a story, write a piece of art that leaves its claws in the internet space forever. But also democracy because that attention isn't necessarily good, and can forever separate an artist from their work if the mob should decide it, in more ways than one, if it's stoked at just the wrong time. And while this means there are more diamonds in the rough, it also means that amazing works of fiction could instead be replaced by something that is just worse, that sticks better in our brains. Do not kill the part of you that is cringe, kill the part of you that cringes. Thanks for watching. Anyway, if you like this video, please leave a like, comment to let me know you like the video, and subscribe for more videos like it. YouTube actually lets me know which videos people subscribe from, so if you enjoy this video and you're not subscribed, subscribing will let me know to make more videos like this one. Also, my Patreon and Ko-fi are in the description, feel free to chuck me money in exchange for your name on the screen right now. Also, follow me on all my other socials if you want, all of which are on screen. For the end of this video, I'm going to list off some popular pieces of media that are actually fanfiction, and no, I will not be taking any criticism. BBC Sherlock, House MD, Elementary, The Great Mouse Detective, BBC Merlin, Dante's Inferno, 2016 Ghostbusters, Gallivant, 300, Batman vs Superman, the entire MCU and every TV show, all CW superhero shows, every war movie such as Dunkirk 1917, Saving Private Ryan, The Lion King, Monster High, Ever After High, Angel, the Buffy the Vampire spin-off, also technically pretty much all spin-offs, Mandalorian, Boba Fett, Obi-Wan, etc., every Robin Hood movie, Jurassic World as a spin-off / reboot, every single biopic, Elvis, Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocketman, every Disney movie based on a Brothers Grimm book, every Christmas movie about Santa, every video game movie / TV show, for example The Witcher, Resident Evil and Sonic, all the Monty Python movies, every Bible-based play or movie including every nativity scene, the Sistine Chapel, all scientific theories, your parents' perception of you as straight and cis, all NFT supplemental products not on the blockchain, every blockchain fork on a cryptocurrency, every single DLC for a video game, and all amendments to the Constitution. Thanks for listening. As always, stay safe, stay spicy, and have a good day.